The shipping container took 11 weeks to arrive, and when it finally did, I stood in the courtyard of my new home in San Miguel de Allende, watching movers carry in box after box after box. And somewhere around the 40th box, a woman named Alicia, who mends and alters clothes out of a small shop 2 doors down and had wandered over out of curiosity at the commotion, asked me, not unkindly, "Todo esto es tuyo? All of this is yours?" I said yes. She looked at the pile, genuinely puzzled, and asked how many people lived in my house. I told her it was just me. She didn't say anything else, but I saw the calculation happening behind her eyes. The same calculation I would spend the next several months making myself, over and over, with mounting discomfort, about exactly how much of what I'd spent a lifetime accumulating I actually needed, used, or even remembered owning. I am 66 years old, and I spent 34 years in advertising, most of them at a large agency in Atlanta, where I eventually ran an entire division focused on consumer products. Which is a polite way of saying, I spent my professional life becoming extremely good at convincing Americans they needed things they didn't have yet. I want to start there, with that specific detail, because I think it matters for what happened later. I wasn't a passive participant in American consumer culture. I helped build it, campaign by campaign, for over 3 decades, and I was good at my job in a way that, looking back now, I have decidedly mixed feelings about. I want to be specific about what that work actually looked like, because I think the phrase "worked in advertising" can sound almost abstract, and my 34 years there were anything but. I ran campaigns for kitchen appliance brands, convincing people their existing blender, still functional, was somehow inadequate for the life they deserved. I helped launch seasonal clothing lines built around the specific manufactured urgency of limited availability, a technique I understood, professionally, to be manipulative even as I got better and better at deploying it. I sat in strategy meetings where we discussed, with complete seriousness, how to make consumers feel a mild, persistent dissatisfaction with what they already owned. Because that dissatisfaction, properly cultivated, was the entire engine of repeat purchase. I was rewarded, promoted, and well paid for being excellent at generating exactly the kind of want that has almost nothing to do with need, and I did that work for over 3 decades, without once turning that same professional scrutiny on my own overflowing closets. I lived, by any reasonable measure, a comfortable and outwardly successful life. A 5-bedroom house in a good Atlanta suburb for a household that, after my divorce 14 years ago and my son leaving for college not long after, consisted of exactly 1 person and, for a while, an increasingly resentful cat. 2 cars in the garage, because at various points I'd convinced myself I needed both a practical one and an aspirational one. A storage unit, 10 minutes from the house, that I'd been paying $180 a month for so long I genuinely could not tell you, if you'd asked me before I moved, what was actually inside it. Closets I hadn't fully opened in years. A pantry I restocked compulsively even as older items expired quietly in the back. Uneaten. Because grocery shopping had become less about need and more about the specific hollow comfort of buying things. A habit I understand now I'd absorbed as thoroughly from my own industry's messaging as anyone I'd ever targeted with a campaign. I want to be honest that I didn't wake up one day and decide to interrogate any of this. What actually happened was considerably less dramatic. I retired at 64, and about a year into retirement, my son Kevin came to visit from Seattle and, standing in my garage looking for a specific tool, asked me, with the particular bluntness only adult children seem able to deploy, "Mom, why do you have 4 sets of golf clubs? You don't play golf." I didn't have a good answer. I'd bought each set at different points over 15 years, always with some vague intention of taking the game back up, always abandoning the intention within a season, always somehow acquiring a newer, supposedly better set the next time the impulse returned, rather than simply using what I already had. Kevin's question sat with me longer than he probably intended it to. That question turned into a slow, uncomfortable audit of my entire house over the following months, closet by closet, drawer by drawer. And what I found genuinely rattled me. Clothing with tags still attached, some of it years old. Kitchen gadgets I could not identify the function of. A guest room stacked with unopened boxes from online orders I had no memory of placing. Impulse purchases from some sleepless 11 p.m. scroll that had apparently arrived, been set down, and never been touched again. I did the math roughly on what all of it had cost, cross-referencing old credit card statements out of a kind of grim curiosity. And the number I arrived at was large enough that I closed the laptop and didn't look at it again for 2 weeks. I found things in that audit that embarrassed me in ways I hadn't expected. A juicer purchased during a brief and entirely uncharacteristic health kick 11 years earlier, used exactly twice, still in its original box. 3 separate sets of luggage, none of them matching, each purchased before a different trip because I'd misplaced or simply forgotten I already owned perfectly functional bags. An entire drawer of cables and chargers for devices I no longer owned, kept, I think, out of some vague anxiety that I might need them someday. A phrase I began noticing myself using constantly throughout that audit. Someday, as though someday were a real place I was actively provisioning for, rather than a vague, anxious abstraction that had quietly justified 2 decades of unnecessary purchases. It was somewhere in that unsettled period that I took a trip to San Miguel de Allende, mostly on a friend's recommendation, mostly as a distraction from the audit I'd started and didn't know how to finish. I remember the specific moment things started to shift. On my 3rd morning, watching my rental's landlady, a woman named Rosa, walk to the daily market with a woven bag, buy exactly what she needed for that day's meals, and walk home. Not a pantry stockpile, not a freezer full of backup groceries, just today's food. Bought fresh, prepared, and eaten, with almost nothing left over to waste. I asked her, through my still clumsy Spanish, if she ever worried about running out of something. She looked at me like the question hadn't fully occurred to her before, and said simply that the market was there every day, so there was nothing to worry about running out of. I asked to go with her the following morning, mostly out of curiosity, and ended up returning most mornings for the rest of that trip, trailing along as she moved between the same handful of stalls, greeting vendors by name, buying tomatoes from one woman specifically because her family had grown them the same way for 2 generations, buying tortillas fresh from a stand that made them by hand, starting before dawn. There was no bulk buying, no stockpiling against some imagined future shortage, just a daily, unhurried relationship with exactly what that particular day required. And I remember standing in her kitchen afterward, watching her cook everything she'd bought within hours of buying it, nothing wasted, nothing forgotten in a drawer to spoil, and feeling something I can only describe as a kind of quiet vertigo, because it was so completely unlike the way I'd shopped and cooked and lived for the entirety of my adult life. That sentence followed me around for the rest of that trip, and honestly, for a long while after I got home. I started noticing, in a way I don't think I'd let myself notice before, how much of my American life had been organized around a specific, low-grade anxiety about scarcity, the giant pantry, the overstuffed freezer, the storage unit, the closets, all of it a kind of insurance policy against a lack I never actually experienced, purchased instead of confronted, over and over, for decades, while an entire industry, my industry, quietly profited from keeping that anxiety exactly well fed enough to never fully resolve. I flew home and did the thing I do with everything, which is build a spreadsheet. Except this time it wasn't a budget for a new purchase. It was an actual accounting of waste. The storage unit, $180 a month for 6 years, over $12,000 spent to store things I couldn't list from memory. The golf clubs, all 4 sets, roughly $2,800 combined, used a total of maybe 9 times across 15 years. Food I'd thrown away, which I started tracking for 1 month out of morbid curiosity, and which came to nearly $140 in spoiled, forgotten groceries in that single month alone. A number that, multiplied out across years of the same habit, made me genuinely sick to my stomach. I want to be careful here, because I don't want this to sound like a lecture about frugality, which isn't really what any of this was about for me. It was about waste specifically, the gap between what I'd acquired and what I'd actually used, lived with, or valued. A gap I hadn't examined honestly in decades, because examining it required admitting how much of my adult life had been spent accumulating instead of living. I sold the house 8 months after that trip, donated or sold the overwhelming majority of what filled it, kept the storage unit only long enough to empty and close it entirely, and moved to San Miguel de Allende permanently that spring, into a modest 3-room casita on a cobblestone street, with roughly 1/10 of the possessions I'd owned back in Atlanta. That 11-week shipping container, the one Alicia watched arrive with such open bewilderment, held what remained after that entire process. And even then, unpacking it, I felt a fresh wave of the same discomfort, because half of what I'd kept, I realized within weeks I still didn't actually need. I want to tell you about Alicia specifically, because she became, without either of us planning it, something like an informal teacher in exactly the area I most needed instruction. Her small shop, Men's Clothing, alters it, repairs it, extends its life by years rather than replacing it. A business model that would have made almost no sense in the Atlanta of my career, where the entire advertising apparatus I'd spent decades building was engineered specifically to make replacement feel not just acceptable but desirable. A treat. A small act of self-care, rather than what it usually actually was, which was waste dressed up in better packaging. I brought her a coat with a torn lining in my 2nd month, expecting to be told it wasn't worth fixing, the reflexive American assumption I hadn't even noticed I was still carrying. She looked at me like I'd asked something strange, mended it in 20 minutes for the peso equivalent of about $4, and handed it back looking, if anything, better than before. I started bringing her things regularly after that. A dress with a broken zipper. Shoes that needed resoling, sent instead to a cobbler 2 streets over. A man named Don Efron, who's been repairing shoes in the same small stall for 31 years, and looked, frankly, a little amused the first time I thanked him, as though he'd performed a small miracle rather than simply done his ordinary work. I started shopping at the daily market the way Rosa had, buying what I needed for a day or 2 at a time, rather than stockpiling weeks in advance, and I noticed, within a few months, that my food waste had dropped to almost nothing. Not through any particular discipline on my part, but simply because I'd stopped buying more than I could reasonably use before it spoiled. Don Efron, in particular, became something of an ongoing lesson in a way of thinking about objects I hadn't encountered since childhood, watching my own grandmother, decades earlier, mend things out of a Depression-era frugality I'd absorbed as quaint, rather than instructive. He showed me, one afternoon while resoling a pair of boots I'd nearly discarded, the stitching underneath the leather, explaining, with the patient pride of someone who genuinely loves his craft, how a well-made shoe is built specifically to be repaired rather than replaced. An entire design philosophy that had simply stopped existing, as far as I could tell, in most of what I'd bought throughout my American life, where cheapness and disposability had become so normalized, I'd stopped noticing them as choices at all, rather than simply how things were. I asked him once, admittedly a little sheepishly, whether he ever worried about running out of work, whether people simply threw things away instead of bringing them to him the way an entire generation back home seemed to. He said business had actually grown over the years he'd been in that stall, not shrunk, because more and more retirees like me kept finding their way to him. Curious, a little embarrassed, and eventually converted. If any of you have ever done your own version of that audit, opened a closet or a storage unit, and felt that specific mix of embarrassment and grief at what you found, I want you to comment below and tell me about it. Because I read every single one, and I think a great many of us are quietly carrying more accumulated waste of money and space and attention than we've ever said out loud to anyone. The waste I'd been carrying wasn't only material, and I think this is the part that surprised me most. The part I hadn't anticipated when I started that spreadsheet back in Atlanta. I started noticing how much time I'd wasted too, decades of it, sitting in traffic on a commute that added up, by my own rough calculation, to something close to a full year of my life spent behind a wheel going nowhere I actually wanted to be. Hours spent scrolling a phone in a house too large and too full of unused things to feel genuinely restful in. Entire weekends organized around errands to acquire more of exactly the kind of things Alicia now helps me keep using instead. Here in San Miguel, I walk most places, 15, 20 minutes at a stretch through streets I've come to know intimately. And those walks, which I resented as inconvenient during my first month, have become some of the most genuinely restorative parts of my day. Unhurried, unplanned, full of small interactions. A nod from Don Efron outside his stall. A wave from the woman who sells flowers near the Jardin that I would never have had time or inclination for in my old life. Moving at speed between destinations, insulated in a car, optimizing for efficiency in a way that I understand now had quietly hollowed out most of my actual days. I think about the sheer volume of decisions I used to make in a given American week. Which store? Which brand? Which of 40 nearly identical products? Decisions I now understand my own former industry had engineered to feel meaningful. A form of self-expression, when in practice they were simply noise, consuming attention and energy I never got back, in service of choices that made almost no lasting difference to my actual life. Here, the market has what it has. Rosa's tomato vendor grows what she grows. And the absence of that constant manufactured decision-making has freed up a kind of mental bandwidth I hadn't realized I'd been spending, for decades, on something so thoroughly unrewarding. My monthly expenses here settle around $1,850. The casita, groceries bought fresh and used almost entirely. Alicia's occasional repairs, Don Efran's risoling, Spanish lessons twice a week, comfortably covered by my pension and Social Security, with meaningfully more left over than my old Atlanta budget ever produced, despite my old salary having been, on paper, considerably larger. I've come to understand that the gap wasn't really about income at all. It was about how much of that income had been quietly, systematically diverted toward acquiring things I'd then need to store, insure, maintain, and eventually discard, a cycle I'd spent 34 years professionally encouraging in other people without ever once turning the same clear eye on my own life. Kevin visited in the spring, walked through my 3-room casita, and asked, half joking, where I kept everything. I told him this was everything, and watched him look around slowly, recalibrating, the way I think most of our visitors do here, against the 5-bedroom house he'd grown up in, stuffed with rooms of furniture and belongings that, if I'm honest, none of us had ever fully used even when we lived among them. He asked about the golf clubs. I told him I'd sold 3 of the 4 sets before I left, kept 1, actual clubs I now use every other week at a small course outside town with 2 women from my Spanish class. More golf, if I'm honest, than I'd played in the entire previous decade combined. because I finally owned exactly the amount of golf equipment my actual golfing life required, rather than an aspirational stockpile ensuring against some future version of myself who never quite arrived. He was quiet for a while that evening, sitting in my small courtyard, and eventually admitted that growing up in that big Atlanta house, he'd always assumed more space and more stuff simply meant more security. More evidence that our family was doing well, and that walking through my 3 rooms here, watching how contentedly I lived inside them, had unsettled some assumption he hadn't realized he was still carrying into his own life back in Seattle, where he and his wife had recently signed a lease on a larger apartment mostly, he admitted, because it seemed like the thing people their age were supposed to want next. I still think, often, about that afternoon watching the shipping container get unloaded, 40 boxes and counting, Alicia's quiet, puzzled question hanging in the courtyard air. All of this is yours? I think about the 34 years in advertising before that, building campaigns engineered around exactly that same quiet, unexamined accumulation, in myself as much as in anyone I was ever paid to persuade. I don't think Americans are uniquely wasteful people, and I don't want this to sound like an indictment of anyone watching. I think we've built, collectively, an entire infrastructure, economic and cultural both, that makes waste the path of least resistance, convenient, marketed, quietly subsidized by storage units and credit, and an industry I spent decades helping design. And it takes a genuine act of dislocation, I think, to see that infrastructure clearly enough to step outside of it. I didn't realize how much I was wasting in America until I moved to Mexico. And I want to be precise about what I mean by that, because it wasn't primarily about money. Even though the money was real, and the number, when I finally added it all up, was larger than I'm entirely comfortable saying out loud on camera. It was about time, and attention, and a particular kind of hollow busyness I'd mistaken, for most of my adult life, for a full one. Alicia mended that coat in 20 minutes for $4 and handed me back something I'd nearly thrown away. And I think about that exchange more than almost anything else from this whole chapter of my life, because it taught me, more clearly than any spreadsheet ever could, that most of what I'd been discarding, materially and otherwise, had never actually needed discarding at all. It had simply needed someone patient enough to mend it. I spent 34 years teaching an entire industry how to manufacture want. It took moving somewhere smaller, slower, and considerably less anxious about scarcity to finally learn the much harder lesson underneath it, which was how to recognize enough. I'm Deborah Gardner. Thank you for listening to Women Choose Mexico.